When Soviet forces breached the gates of Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, they discovered something that defied comprehension: mountains of human hair. Rooms filled with shoes, glasses, and suitcases. And behind the barbed wire, skeletal figures who barely resembled human beings anymore. What these soldiers witnessed was the end result of the most systematic program of human destruction in recorded history. But the physical evidence they found told only part of the story. The real horror lay in the daily experiences of the prisoners who had somehow managed to survive until liberation. Today, we'll take you inside the walls of Auschwitz to understand what life was truly like for those imprisoned there. You'll learn about the deliberate starvation, the medical experiments, the impossible choices that prisoners faced every single day, and the remarkable acts of resistance that occurred even in humanity's darkest hour. This is not just a story about death. It's a story about what happens when human beings are stripped of everything that makes life worth living, yet somehow find ways to maintain their humanity against impossible odds. The journey to Auschwitz began long before prisoners saw the infamous gates with their cruel inscription, Arbeit macht frei. Work makes you free. For most, it started in cattle cars designed to transport livestock, not human beings. These sealed wagons, packed with up to 100 people each, traveled for days without stops for food, water, or sanitation. Dr. Viktor Frankl, who would later become a renowned psychiatrist, was among those transported to Auschwitz in 1944. He described how prisoners were forced to stand pressed against each other for the entire journey, with no room to sit or lie down. The elderly and sick collapsed and died during transport, their bodies remaining upright, supported by the crush of living prisoners around them. When the trains finally stopped and the doors were thrown open, prisoners emerged into a world of controlled chaos. SS guards with clubs and whips drove them from the cars, while trained dogs barked and lunged at anyone who moved too slowly. The first lesson of Auschwitz was immediate and brutal. Hesitation meant violence. What happened next would determine whether a prisoner lived for months or died within hours. The selection process, conducted on the railway platform, divided new arrivals into two groups. Those deemed fit for work were sent to one side. The elderly, the sick, mothers with young children, and anyone who appeared unable to perform hard labor were directed toward what they were told were shower facilities. These first selections were conducted with deliberate deception. Guards assured prisoners that families would be reunited after processing, that the separation was temporary, and that everyone would receive food and medical care. Parents kissed their children goodbye, believing they would see them again in a few hours. For those selected for work, the real horror was just beginning. They were stripped of their clothes, their hair was shaved off, and they were given prison uniforms that rarely fit properly. Their personal belongings, photographs, letters, jewelry, anything that connected them to their former lives, were taken away and sorted by other prisoners for shipment back to Germany. But the most devastating loss was their names. Each prisoner received a number that was tattooed onto their left forearm. From that moment forward, they ceased to exist as individuals and became part of a vast system designed to extract every ounce of useful work from their bodies before discarding them. The psychological impact of this process was immediate and profound. Prisoners described feeling as though they had died and entered a different world, where normal human values and relationships no longer applied. What they didn't yet understand was that this dehumanization was not accidental, but carefully designed to break their will to resist and there to support one another. The Nazi system at Auschwitz was engineered with scientific precision to extract maximum labor from prisoners, while providing the minimum resources necessary to keep them alive. At the center of this system was a carefully calculated program of starvation that kept prisoners weak enough to be controllable, but strong enough to work. The daily food ration for prisoners consisted of approximately 1,300 calories, less than half of what an adult male needs to maintain basic bodily functions, and far below what was required for the heavy manual labor that prisoners were forced to perform. Breakfast consisted of a bitter liquid that was called coffee, but contained no actual coffee. Lunch was a watery soup made from turnips, potatoes, and occasionally small pieces of meat that were usually rotten. The evening meal was the day's largest. a small piece of black bread and a tiny portion of margarine or jam. This bread, which often contained sawdust and other inedible materials, became the most precious commodity in the camp. Prisoners would save portions of their bread ration to trade for other necessities, even though eating it immediately was often the difference between having strength for the next day's work or collapsing from hunger. The effects of this systematic starvation were visible within weeks of arrival. New prisoners, who might have been healthy adults when they arrived, quickly developed the gaunt, skeletal appearance that survivors would carry for the rest of their lives. Their bodies began consuming muscle tissue and internal organs to survive, leading to a condition that doctors called hunger disease. But starvation was about more than just physical weakness. Chronic hunger affected prisoners' ability to think clearly, to form relationships, and to maintain the psychological defenses that might have helped them resist their captors. Guards understood this and used food as a weapon of control, rewarding cooperation with extra rations and punishing resistance by reducing the already inadequate food supply. The kitchen staff, who were themselves prisoners, faced impossible moral choices. They could provide equal portions to everyone, knowing that many would die, or they could give larger portions to prisoners who seemed most likely to survive, essentially deciding who would live and who would die. These decisions haunted survivors for decades after liberation. Some prisoners found ways to supplement their official rations through an underground economy that developed within the camp. Those who worked in the kitchens, warehouses, or sorting facilities sometimes had access to extra food or items that could be traded. But participating in this black market economy required taking enormous risks, as being caught meant severe punishment or death. The deliberate nature of this starvation program becomes even more chilling when we understand what awaited those prisoners, whose bodies finally gave out under the strain. While starvation slowly destroyed prisoners' bodies, a select group faced an even more horrific fate in the medical blocks of Auschwitz. Under the direction of SS physicians, prisoners were subjected to experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics and human decency. Dr. Joseph Mengele, who became known as the Angel of Death, conducted the most notorious of these experiments. Mengele was particularly interested in twins, whom he would select during the arrival process and house in special barracks. These children and adults were subjected to a range of procedures designed to study heredity, genetic abnormalities, and the effects of various medical interventions. Mengele's twin experiments included injecting chemicals into prisoners' eyes to try to change their color, amputating limbs and organs to study the effects on the surviving twin, and exposing subjects to diseases to observe how infection progressed. He maintained detailed records of these experiments, treating human beings as laboratory specimens rather than living people with thoughts, feelings, and families. Other prisoners were subjected to sterilization experiments designed to develop methods for preventing reproduction among populations the Nazis deemed undesirable. These procedures, performed without anesthesia, left many prisoners permanently injured or dead. The physicians conducting these experiments saw them as contributions to Nazi racial ideology rather than violations of basic human rights. Dr. Karl Klauberg, another SS physician, conducted experiments on female prisoners to develop methods of mass sterilization that could be implemented quickly and cheaply. His procedures involved injecting caustic substances into women's reproductive organs, causing excruciating pain and often death. Those who survived were frequently left with permanent injuries that affected them for the rest of their lives. The medical block also served as a place where prisoners who were too sick or injured to work could be eliminated through lethal injections. Prisoners learned to hide illnesses and injuries whenever possible, knowing that seeking medical attention might result in death rather than treatment. Perhaps most disturbing was the fact that these experiments were conducted by trained physicians who had taken oaths to do no harm. They maintained detailed scientific records, published their findings in medical journals, and believed they were advancing human knowledge. The complete abandonment of medical ethics at Auschwitz demonstrated how professional training and scientific methodology could be corrupted in service of ideological goals. The survivors of these medical experiments faced a unique form of trauma that continued long after liberation. They had been betrayed not just by guards and administrators, but by members of a profession dedicated to healing and preserving life. But even in the medical blocks, prisoners found ways to resist and support one another that would prove crucial to their survival. For prisoners who survived the initial selection and avoided the medical experiments, daily survival depended on their assignment to work details known as commandos. These assignments, which determined where prisoners worked and under what conditions, could mean the difference between living for months or dying within weeks. The most feared assignment was to the Sonderkommando, the special units forced to work directly in the gas chambers and crematoriums. These prisoners, who were kept separate from the general population, were responsible for leading new arrivals to the gas chambers, removing bodies after the killings, and burning the remains. The psychological trauma of this work was so intense that the SS regularly executed entire Sonderkommando units and replaced them with new prisoners to prevent them from becoming too knowledgeable about the killing process. Members of the Sonderkommando lived with the knowledge that they were facilitating the murder of their fellow prisoners, including sometimes their own family members. They were given better food and living conditions than other prisoners, but they also knew that their own deaths were inevitable. Despite these impossible circumstances, some Sonderkommando members managed to document what they witnessed, hiding written accounts and photographs that would later provide crucial evidence of the Nazi crimes. Other work details involved construction projects, factory work, or maintenance of the camp itself. Prisoners assigned to construction faced backbreaking labor in all weather conditions, often without proper tools or safety equipment. They were expected to move heavy materials, dig foundations, and build structures while suffering from malnutrition and exhaustion. The IG Farben synthetic rubber factory, known as Monowitz or Auschwitz III, employed thousands of prisoners in industrial production. Prisoners who worked at this facility faced a different kind of hell. The combination of dangerous industrial processes, brutal working conditions, and the constant pressure to meet production quotas. Those who couldn't keep up were sent back to Birkenau, where they faced almost certain death. Agricultural work details might seem preferable, but they came with their own dangers. Prisoners working in the fields were exposed to harsh weather, had limited access to shelter, and were often far from the main camp where they might receive medical attention if injured. The guards supervising these details were often particularly brutal, using agricultural tools as weapons against prisoners who worked too slowly. The most coveted assignments were indoor jobs that provided some protection from the weather and access to additional resources. Prisoners who worked in the kitchens, warehouses, or administrative offices had better chances of survival, but these positions were limited and often controlled by prisoner hierarchies that had developed within the camp. The capos, prisoners who supervised work details, occupied a particularly complex position in camp society. Some used their authority to protect fellow prisoners and make work assignments more bearable. Others became as brutal as the SS guards, believing that demonstrating cruelty toward other prisoners would improve their own chances of survival. These work assignments created moral dilemmas that prisoners carried with them long after liberation, but they also provided opportunities for resistance and mutual aid that proved crucial to survival. Despite the Nazi system's efforts to isolate prisoners and prevent organized resistance, underground networks developed throughout Auschwitz that provided crucial support for survival. These networks operated in secret, using coded communications and carefully planned activities to avoid detection by guards and informants. One of the most important functions of these networks was the sharing of information. Prisoners who worked in different parts of the camp would pass along news about selections, transport schedules, and changes in camp policy. This information allowed other prisoners to prepare for dangerous situations and sometimes avoid the worst assignments or punishments. The underground also organized the distribution of additional food and medical supplies. Prisoners who had access to extra resources through their work assignments would share them with those most in need, particularly children, elderly prisoners, and those recovering from illness or injury. This redistribution system helped keep more prisoners alive than would have been possible if everyone had relied solely on official rations. Religious and cultural activities provided another form of resistance. Despite the risk of severe punishment, prisoners organized secret religious services, taught children about their cultural heritage, and maintained intellectual discussions that helped preserve their humanity. These activities reminded prisoners that they were more than just numbers, and helped maintain hope for liberation. Some resistance efforts were more directly confrontational. Prisoners sabotaged equipment in the factories where they worked, slowing production and reducing the Nazi war effort. They also helped organize escapes. Although these were extremely dangerous and rarely successful, the Nazi policy of collective punishment meant that attempted escapes often resulted in the execution of other prisoners. The most dramatic act of resistance occurred in October 1944, when members of the Sonderkommando staged an uprising, using explosives smuggled from a munitions factory by female prisoners. They destroyed one of the crematoriums and killed several SS guards. The uprising was ultimately suppressed, and most of the participants were executed. But it demonstrated that even in Auschwitz, the human spirit could not be completely broken. Perhaps most importantly, the underground networks helped prisoners maintain connections with the outside world. They smuggled letters and messages to family members, documented Nazi crimes for future testimony, and preserved personal items that connected prisoners to their former lives. These resistance activities came at enormous personal risk, but they provided psychological benefits that were often crucial to survival. Prisoners who participated in underground activities reported feeling more human and maintaining better morale than those who remained passive. The networks that developed within Auschwitz demonstrated that even in the most dehumanizing circumstances, people could find ways to support one another and resist their oppressors. Among the most heartbreaking aspects of the Auschwitz story were the experiences of children who found themselves trapped in this nightmare. Most children who arrived at Auschwitz were immediately sent to the gas chambers, but those who were selected for labor faced unique challenges that tested their ability to survive in ways that differed significantly from adult prisoners. Children who appeared old enough to work were often separated from their parents during the initial selection process. This separation, which was usually permanent, created immediate trauma that affected everything about their subsequent experience in the camp. Many children never learned what had happened to their parents and spent their time in Auschwitz, hoping for reunion that would never come. The daily routines that were difficult for adults became nearly impossible for children. The long roll calls, where prisoners stood at attention for hours in all weather conditions, were particularly brutal for small bodies that couldn't maintain the required posture. Children who collapsed or moved during these ceremonies faced severe beatings or death. Work assignments for children often involved tasks that were supposedly less physically demanding, but were actually designed to exploit their small size and nimble fingers. They sorted belongings taken from murdered prisoners, worked in tight spaces in construction projects, and performed detailed tasks in factories. Despite being given work that was theoretically suited to their abilities, children were held to the same production standards as adults and faced the same punishments for failing to meet quotas. The starvation rations that barely sustained adults were completely inadequate for growing children. Many child prisoners experienced stunted growth and developmental delays that affected them for the rest of their lives. The combination of malnutrition, psychological trauma, and physical abuse created damage that extended far beyond their time in the camp. Some children formed surrogate family relationships with adult prisoners who took on protective roles. These relationships provided emotional support and sometimes practical advantages, as adults would share food or shelter children from the worst abuses. However, these connections also created additional trauma when protective adults died or were transferred to other parts of the camp. The children who survived Auschwitz often did so through a combination of luck, the protection of adults, and their own remarkable resilience. Many demonstrated an ability to adapt to impossible circumstances and find small sources of joy even in the darkest environment. They played games with scraps of material, told stories to each other, and maintained friendships that helped them remember what normal childhood relationships could be like. Educational activities organized by adult prisoners provided another source of hope for children. Despite the risk of punishment, some adults secretly taught children basic literacy, mathematics, and cultural traditions. These lessons served both practical and psychological purposes, preparing children for life after liberation, while helping them maintain connections to their pre-war identities. The liberation of Auschwitz revealed hundreds of children who had somehow managed to survive. Many were orphans who had lost their entire families, and most required extensive medical treatment and psychological support. Their survival represented both the ultimate triumph of human resilience and a stark reminder of what had been lost. The experiences of children in Auschwitz demonstrated both the complete moral bankruptcy of the Nazi system and the remarkable capacity of human beings to maintain hope and humanity, even in the most impossible circumstances. The living conditions in Auschwitz were designed not just to house prisoners efficiently, but to strip away every aspect of normal human life that might maintain dignity or provide comfort. The barracks, which had been originally designed for horses, were converted to hold hundreds of prisoners in spaces meant for a fraction of that number. Prisoners slept on wooden bunks arranged in 3 tiers, with up to 10 people sharing a bunk designed for 1 or 2. There were no mattresses, pillows, or blankets adequate for the number of prisoners. During winter, when temperatures dropped well below freezing, prisoners huddled together for warmth while many died of exposure during the night. The complete lack of privacy created additional psychological trauma. Prisoners had no personal space, no place to retreat for solitude, and no opportunity for private conversations or thoughts. Every aspect of their lives was visible to others, creating a sense of exposure that many survivors described as particularly dehumanizing. Sanitation facilities were grossly inadequate and deliberately designed to humiliate prisoners. Latrines consisted of long wooden benches with holes, with no privacy barriers between positions. Prisoners were allowed limited time to use these facilities, creating additional stress and health problems. The lack of adequate washing facilities meant that prisoners could not maintain basic hygiene, leading to widespread disease and skin conditions. Water was strictly rationed and often contaminated. Prisoners desperate for liquids would drink from puddles or try to collect rainwater, risking disease and punishment. The constant thirst, combined with inadequate food, created physical discomfort that affected every moment of prisoners' lives. Personal belongings were virtually non-existent. Prisoners were allowed to keep almost nothing that connected them to their former lives or provided comfort. A piece of string, a button, or a small photograph became treasured possessions that prisoners would risk severe punishment to hide and protect. The barracks were also sites of informal prisoner society. Despite the crowded conditions and constant surveillance, prisoners developed relationships, shared resources, and created informal networks of support. These relationships often meant the difference between survival and death, as prisoners would share food, provide medical care, and offer emotional support during the darkest moments. Disease spread rapidly through the overcrowded barracks. Typhus, dysentery, and other infectious diseases were constant threats. Prisoners who became ill often tried to hide their symptoms, knowing that serious illness usually meant selection for death. Those who could no longer work were typically murdered rather than treated. The daily routine of barrack life was punctuated by roll calls that could last for hours. Prisoners were required to stand at attention while guards counted and recounted, often in harsh weather conditions. These roll calls served no practical purpose beyond demonstrating the guards' absolute control over prisoners' time and bodies. Punishments within the barracks were swift and brutal. Guards would enter at any time of day or night to conduct searches, impose collective punishments for minor infractions, or simply terrorize prisoners. The uncertainty and fear created by these random intrusions added another layer of psychological trauma to an already impossible situation. Despite these conditions, prisoners found ways to maintain fragments of their humanity. They told stories, shared memories of their former lives, and created informal rituals that provided comfort and continuity. These small acts of resistance helped many prisoners maintain their sanity and will to survive. The destruction of normal living conditions was a deliberate strategy designed to break prisoners' spirits and make them easier to control, but it also inadvertently created opportunities for solidarity and mutual support that proved crucial to survival. Perhaps no aspect of life in Auschwitz created more terror than the regular selections that determined which prisoners would continue living and which would be sent to the gas chambers. These selections occurred with unpredictable frequency and could happen at any time of day or night, creating a constant atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. The selection process was designed to appear rational and systematic, but it was actually arbitrary and often based on the momentary whims of SS doctors or guards. Prisoners were ordered to undress and walk past SS personnel who made split-second decisions about their fate. Those who appeared too thin, too weak, or too sick were separated from the group and sent to their deaths. The preparation for selections created its own form of torture. Prisoners who learned that a selection was coming would spend hours trying to make themselves appear healthy and strong, They would pinch their cheeks to create color, practice walking with confident postures, and help each other hide signs of illness or injury. These desperate attempts to appear fit for continued labor represented a grotesque parody of normal human vanity and self-care. Some prisoners developed strategies for surviving selections. They would try to position themselves in the middle of groups, rather than at the beginning or end, hoping to avoid standing out. Others would attempt to make brief eye contact with the selecting officials, believing that acknowledging their humanity might improve their chances. Most understood that these strategies provided only the illusion of control over an essentially random process. The aftermath of selections was often as traumatic as the events themselves. Prisoners who had survived would return to barracks to find that friends, family members, or work partners had been taken. The bonds that prisoners had formed with each other were constantly broken by these arbitrary separations, creating a chronic sense of loss and grief. Selections also occurred in the camp hospital, where prisoners who had sought medical attention found themselves at risk of being murdered rather than treated. This created an impossible situation where prisoners had to choose between seeking help for serious illnesses and risking immediate death. Many chose to suffer in silence rather than report to the medical facilities. The most horrific selections involved children and elderly prisoners who were almost automatically condemned to death. Mothers were forced to watch their children being taken away, while adult children had to say goodbye to elderly parents. These scenes of family separation represented some of the most traumatic experiences that survivors carried with them for the rest of their lives. Some selections targeted specific groups or professions: intellectuals, political prisoners, or members of particular nationalities might be selected for execution as part of broader Nazi policies. These targeted selections created additional anxiety among prisoners, who never knew whether their background or beliefs might make them the next target. The randomness of selections also created survivor guilt among those who were repeatedly spared, while others around them were murdered. Many survivors struggled for decades with questions about why they had lived while others died, and whether they could have done anything to save those who were taken. The selection system was designed not just to eliminate prisoners who were no longer useful for labor, but to maintain psychological control over those who remained. The constant threat of arbitrary death made prisoners focus on immediate survival, rather than long-term planning or resistance activities. Despite the terror created by selections, prisoners found ways to support each other through these ordeals. They would stand together during the process, provide comfort to those who had lost loved ones, and maintain hope that liberation would come before the next selection claimed their own lives. The selection system represented the ultimate expression of Nazi ideology: the reduction of human beings to their economic utility and the assertion of absolute power over life and death. On January 27, 1945, soldiers of the Soviet 61st Army approached the gates of Auschwitz, expecting to find another abandoned German military installation. Instead, they discovered a vast complex of camps containing thousands of prisoners who were barely alive, along with evidence of crimes that defied comprehension. The Nazi evacuation of Auschwitz had begun weeks earlier, as Soviet forces advanced through Poland. SS guards had forced approximately 60,000 prisoners to march westward in what became known as death marches. Those who were too weak to walk or who collapsed along the way were shot and left by the roadside. The guards abandoned the remaining 7,000 prisoners, most of whom were too sick or weak to travel. The Soviet soldiers who entered the camp found prisoners who looked more like skeletons than living human beings. Many weighed less than 80 pounds and were so weak they could barely stand. The liberators discovered warehouses filled with human hair, shoes, eyeglasses, and other personal belongings taken from murdered prisoners. In the crematoriums, they found partially burned human remains and evidence of the systematic murder that had taken place. The immediate priority was providing medical care to survivors who were dying from starvation, disease, and exhaustion. Many prisoners were so malnourished that eating normal food could kill them, requiring careful refeeding programs supervised by medical personnel. Despite these efforts, hundreds of prisoners died in the weeks following liberation, their bodies too damaged to recover from years of abuse. For the survivors, liberation brought a complex mix of emotions. Relief at being free was tempered by grief for family members and friends who had not survived, and by the overwhelming challenge of rebuilding their lives. Many discovered that their entire families had been murdered, and that their former homes and communities no longer existed. The psychological impact of liberation was as significant as the physical recovery. Prisoners who had lived for months or years under conditions of absolute terror and dehumanization had to readjust to a world where they were treated as human beings rather than numbers. This transition was often more difficult than outsiders understood, as survivors struggled with trauma, guilt, and the challenge of explaining their experiences to people who had not shared them. The documentation of conditions at Auschwitz by Soviet forces, and later by Western journalists and investigators, provided crucial evidence for understanding the full scope of Nazi crimes. Photographs, film footage, and written testimony from liberation became essential records for historical understanding and legal proceedings against war criminals. Many survivors faced additional challenges after liberation, including displacement, illness, and the difficulty of finding relatives or rebuilding careers. The trauma they had experienced continued to affect their lives for decades, influencing their relationships, their ability to trust others, and their understanding of human nature. The liberation of Auschwitz marked the end of the most systematic program of human destruction in recorded history, but it also marked the beginning of a long process of bearing witness to what had occurred and working to ensure that such atrocities would never be repeated. The stories of survival that emerged from Auschwitz became testimonies to the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of remembering history's darkest chapters. These accounts continue to educate new generations about the consequences of hatred, intolerance, and the abandonment of basic human values. The suffering experienced by prisoners in Auschwitz represents one of the darkest chapters in human history, but it also demonstrates the remarkable capacity of human beings to maintain dignity, hope, and humanity under the most extreme circumstances. The survivors who lived through this nightmare became witnesses to both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human resilience. Their testimonies, preserved in thousands of hours of recorded interviews, written memoirs, and court proceedings, provide an invaluable record of what happened when a modern, educated society abandoned its moral principles and embraced systematic murder as state policy. These accounts serve as both historical documents and warnings about what can happen when hatred and intolerance are allowed to flourish unchecked. The physical structures of Auschwitz have been preserved as a memorial and museum, allowing visitors from around the world to see the barracks, gas chambers, and crematoriums where these crimes were committed. But the most powerful testimony comes from the survivors themselves, whose voices continue to educate new generations about the importance of protecting human rights and dignity. The lessons learned from Auschwitz extend far beyond the specific historical context of Nazi Germany. The conditions that allowed such atrocities to occur, the dehumanization of targeted groups, the abandonment of ethical principles by professionals and institutions, and the willingness of ordinary people to participate in or ignore systematic violence remain relevant in our contemporary world. The survivors of Auschwitz have dedicated their lives to ensuring that their experiences are not forgotten and that future generations understand the consequences of unchecked hatred and authoritarianism. Their testimony reminds us that the protection of human dignity and the prevention of genocide require constant vigilance and active engagement from all members of society. As we remember the suffering of the prisoners in Auschwitz, we honor not only those who died, but also those who survived to tell their stories. Their courage in bearing witness to these experiences has provided humanity with invaluable lessons about the importance of empathy, tolerance, and the fundamental worth of every human being. The memory of Auschwitz challenges us to recognize our shared humanity and to work actively to create a world where such atrocities can never occur again. In remembering the suffering of its prisoners, we commit ourselves to protecting the dignity and rights of all people, everywhere. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.